The night my grandfather leaned back in his leather chair, looked at me with that unreadable half-smile and asked, "So son, how do you spend your $3.4 million trust fund?" Was the night every assumption I ever had about my family cracked open like a bone snapped clean, because for a second I thought he was joking, some weird attempt at dry humor, but when I blinked and said, "What trust fund?" his expression didn't change. If anything, it sharpened, and the room felt smaller, tighter, like all the air was being pulled into the gravity of those few words. And in the silence that followed, I could hear my heartbeat punching through my ears as I realized he wasn't teasing and that something enormous had been moving beneath my life for years without me noticing. Something secret and intentional and coated in layers of silence so thick I never even suspected it existed. And suddenly I was hyper-aware of the house around us. His house, the one that smelled like old money and cedar wood, the one with walls covered in framed degrees and oil paintings of ancestors who looked like they'd never worried about anything more stressful than which horse to bet on. While he watched me with a kind of disappointment that didn't make sense yet, like he'd expected a very different reaction, like my confusion itself was an insult. And as my stomach tightened, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a moment loaded with history I didn't know. A moment I wasn't prepared for, and my voice cracked when I repeated, softer this time, "What trust fund?" which made him exhale sharply, almost scoff and mutter, "I knew it," before pushing himself up from the chair with the stiffness of someone who has carried more weight than his frame was meant for, and he walked toward the huge window overlooking the dark yard, saying nothing at all, just breathing slow and controlled like he was trying not to explode, and I sat there frozen, the pit in my stomach opening wider as I replayed his question in my head. $3,400,000, a number so huge it didn't feel real, a number that could rewrite someone's entire life. And I started to feel something hot and acidic rising in my chest, because if he was telling the truth, if there really was a trust fund, then someone had known about it, someone had hidden it, someone had lied to me in a way so massive it made my brain vibrate, and my thoughts exploded with questions that didn't have space to exist yet. Was it my mom? My dad? Both of them? Why would they hide something like that? Who does that to their kid? And why was my grandfather behaving like this? Like I was supposed to know, like I'd already failed some test I didn't even know I was taking. And before I could speak again, he finally turned around, his jaw tight, his eyes red with something that wasn't sadness but something heavier, angrier, and he said, "Your father promised me he'd tell you when you turned 18. And the world tilted because I was 26, and I felt suddenly like the room had dropped 10 degrees, and I stammered, "He never said anything. Not once." Which made him let out this bitter laugh, the kind that sounds like it hurts, and he said, "Of course he didn't," before sinking back into the chair like the truth itself was exhausting, and I leaned forward with my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white, begging him with my eyes to explain, but he rubbed his forehead and said, "This trust fund was meant for you, for your future, for your stability, for a life where you never had to struggle like he did." And the way he said struggle carried a layered resentment I hadn't heard from him before, and he added, "But your father insisted he could manage it until you were old enough. He insisted he'd tell you. He insisted he'd be responsible." And those words, "he insisted," hit me like a punch, because suddenly I saw years of weird moments click together like puzzle pieces. The tension in their conversations, the way my dad always shut down whenever Grandpa's name came up, the way he always emphasized being careful with money, even when we were supposedly fine, and something inside my chest cracked open as I whispered, "So, he's had access to it? Since I was 18? And Grandpa gave a slow, deliberate nod that felt heavier than 1,000 words, and a cold flush spread through me so violently I had to grip the arms of the chair to stay grounded, because it felt like my entire childhood, my entire 20s, every struggle I'd ever had, working double shifts, taking community college classes because I couldn't afford university, skipping insurance for months because I needed to pay rent, was suddenly recontextualized into something cruel and deliberate, something that didn't have to happen, something someone chose to let happen, and I could feel anger rising in waves, sharp and uncontrollable, but underneath it was something worse, something hollow and shaking. Betrayal, deep betrayal, betrayal with teeth, betrayal with fingerprints, and when I finally managed to speak, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else as I said, "Grandpa, what exactly did he do with it?" And he hesitated, his expression shifting into something like dread, and that hesitation alone made my pulse spike, because it meant he knew something he didn't want to say, something that was about to make everything so much worse, And he looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they were, eyes that had seen too many lies and held too many secrets, and he said, "Before I answer that, you need to tell me something honestly. Have you noticed anything strange with your parents' finances? Any changes?" And the fact that he asked that question, so calm, so pointed, sent a chill down my spine because it meant there was something to notice, something he suspected, and my brain rifled through memories so fast they blurred together. The expensive SUV they bought last year, even though my dad claimed business was slow, the sudden home renovation my mom brushed off as a great deal, the luxury vacations they bragged about on Facebook, the designer handbags mom said were gifts, the way they always told me they couldn't help with tuition or rent because money was tight, money was tight, money was tight. All those years of that phrase now ringing in my skull like an alarm, and my throat tightened as I whispered, yeah, actually, a lot." And Grandpa closed his eyes like he already knew, like he'd known for years, like he'd been waiting for this truth to bloom into something undeniable. And when he opened them again, they were cold in a way that scared me, and he said 7 words that hollowed me out from the inside. "I think they stole your entire future." When my grandfather said those words, "I think they stole your entire future," it felt like the air was sucked out of the room, like the world paused long enough for my pulse to thunder in my throat, and I stared at him, trying to process the idea that my own parents, the people who told me to work hard, be responsible, be grateful, be patient, had been living off money that wasn't theirs while I scraped by paycheck to paycheck, and something inside me fractured. A slow, spreading crack like a fault line preparing to split open, and I muttered, That can't be right, Grandpa, they wouldn't do that." Except even as I said it, my voice wavered, because deep down I could already see the truth forming in the shadows of my memory, slipping into place like a horrifying mosaic, and Grandpa didn't argue. He just looked at me with this mix of sadness and fury, the kind that only builds after years of watching something go wrong and being unable to fix it, and he said, "Son, your father has always believed he was owed something," in a voice so low it almost vibrated. He felt overshadowed by this family, felt that everyone had more than he did, felt entitled to whatever he could get his hands on. And hearing that made my stomach twist because I'd always known my dad carried insecurity like a ghost on his shoulder, but I never imagined it could mutate into something this big, this destructive. And Grandpa continued, "When you were a kid, he told me he wanted you to learn the value of hard work." I agreed, but what he didn't tell me was that he also wanted full control. He wanted to manage the trust for you. First, I believed him. I thought he was trying to be a good father. But every year the reports got thinner. Every year I asked more questions. And every year he dodged them. His voice shook with rising anger, and I felt my own anger growing with his, the kind that crawls under your skin like fire, and I asked, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you check with me directly?" And the pain in his eyes made me feel like I'd punched him as he whispered, "Because I made a mistake. I trusted him. I believed he would do right by you. I thought telling you too early would add pressure you didn't need." And by the time I realized the truth, he had already found ways to shut me out legally. Legally. That word hit me like a slap because it meant intention, it meant planning, it meant this wasn't some simple misunderstanding or sloppy accounting. It meant someone had built a system to hide things from me, protect themselves, block my grandfather from interfering. And I felt a hot wave of nausea as I remembered how my dad always insisted on handling the paperwork, how he always said things like, "Don't worry about the details," how he once yelled at me for opening a piece of mail addressed to me but sent to their house, telling me I needed to respect boundaries, and now I saw it all differently. He wasn't protecting boundaries, he was protecting access, and Grandpa leaned back exhausted and said, "I confronted him last year. I told him I wanted to see the full account statements." He finally admitted the truth. Most of the money was gone. Gone. It was like every beat of my heart hit a brick wall. I whispered, "Gone as in spent?" And he nodded slowly, painfully, like the movement itself carried weight. "He used it for the house, the vacations, the business your mother insisted they needed to expand, your sister's college tuition, cars, God knows what else." And he said, Grandpa's voice hardened, "He said you didn't need it, because he believed spoiling you would ruin you." That last line made my vision swim because the absurdity of it, the hypocrisy of it, slammed into me. The man who bought himself luxury cars, who took vacations every year, who lived comfortably while telling me to just push through the struggle, had convinced himself that I was the one who didn't need money, that depriving me was some moral lesson, that he was the wise, responsible parent while he was draining money meant for my future like it was his personal savings account. And something inside me snapped, a sharp internal sound like a bone breaking, and I stood up too fast, pacing because my body couldn't handle being still, and I felt anger swelling until it was almost uncontainable. But beneath that anger was grief for the version of my life I never got to live, the opportunities one never had, the years I spent feeling like I was failing when really I was being sabotaged by the people I trusted most. Why didn't he just talk to me? I muttered, mostly to myself. Why didn't he tell me? Why hide it? And Grandpa answered in a voice that sounded like it hurt to speak. Because if you knew, you would have asked questions. You would have expected access. You would have wanted to understand the money. And he couldn't risk that. Not once he had already spent more than half. I stopped pacing. My jaw clenched so hard the muscle ached. How much is left? I whispered. Grandpa didn't look away. Almost nothing, he said. Less than 200,000. And even that, I'm not sure he hasn't touched since the last time I checked. The room swayed and I had to put a hand on the back of the couch to steady myself because the impact of that number hit me like a blow to the gut. Less than 200,000 from 3.4 million, and all those moments I went hungry, all those nights I worked overtime instead of studying, all those times I felt worthless and behind, all of them were unnecessary, all of them could have been avoided if the people who raised me hadn't decided I didn't deserve to know my own future existed. And as tears burned the corners of my eyes, a new kind of resolve took shape, dark and sharp and pulsing like a heartbeat, because I realized something important. If they had lied for 8 years, if they had kept this secret and spent that money without guilt, then confronting them wasn't just a conversation. It was stepping into a battlefield built out of lies, entitlement, and manipulation, and I didn't know who they would become when cornered. But I knew I needed answers, needed truth from their own mouths, needed to stand in front of them and say the words they'd spent years trying to prevent me from saying. Grandpa watched the storm forming in my expression, and he didn't try to stop me. He just said quietly, "Be careful, son. Secrets like this, they don't break quietly." And as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, heart pounding like a war drum, I understood exactly what he meant, because nothing about the next confrontation would be simple, and the people I was about to face were not the parents I once believed they were. They were strangers wearing familiar faces, and I was about to rip those masks off. Driving to my parents' house felt like steering straight into a storm I'd been too blind to see forming, and every mile that passed made the anger inside me swell hotter, tighter, until it felt like something was going to crack open in my chest. And by the time I pulled into their driveway, a driveway newly paved last year, something my dad bragged about like it was a trophy, I felt a sick twist in my gut because now I knew exactly what had paid for it. And the house itself looked different too. Not physically but spiritually, like the walls had been holding their breath for years, storing lies like insulation. And when I stepped inside without knocking, my mom turned around from the kitchen island with a bright smile that instantly faltered when she saw my face. A smile she probably practiced in the mirror because appearances were her religion, and she said, "Honey, is everything okay?" In that carefully controlled, sugar-sweet tone she used whenever she sensed something might disrupt the perfect image she curated for the world. And before I could even answer, my dad walked in from the den holding a glass of something expensive. Of course it was expensive. And he frowned the moment he saw me, like my presence was an inconvenience, and he said, "You could have called before showing up." And those 9 words broke something in me. Because here he was, the man who stole my future, still acting like I owed him courtesy, and I met his eyes and said, "We need to talk." And the way his expression flickered, fear, annoyance, calculation, told me everything I needed to know. He already knew what this was about. He had been waiting for this moment like someone who knew the fuse had been lit years ago, and now the flame had finally reached the bomb. Mom glanced between us nervously, wiping her hands on a towel even though they were already dry, and asked, "What's going on?" But Dad cut in sharply. "Whatever it is, we can discuss it calmly." And that made my blood boil because calm discussions are what honest families have, and we weren't one, not anymore, and maybe we never were. I took a breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass and said, "Grandpa told me everything." And the instant those words left my mouth, the air in the room shifted so dramatically it felt physical, like the gravity changed, and Mom's face drained of color while Dad's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. And for a second no one moved, like we were suspended in a moment that could shatter in any direction, and then he said, "I see." In this cold, resigned tone that was Scarier than any explosion, because it was the tone of someone who had already decided they weren't going to apologize, not even a little. I stepped forward, feeling my pulse thundering in my ears as I said, "You've been hiding a $3.4 million trust fund from me since I was 18. And Mom let out a small gasp like she'd been slapped, but Dad didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even look surprised, and instead he said, "That money wasn't going to help you become a responsible adult." And those words hit me with such violent disbelief that I actually laughed, one short, humorless sound, because the man standing in front of me, wearing a watch worth more than my car, had the audacity to act like depriving me of my own money was some selfless parenting strategy, and I spat out, "Responsible? You mean broke? Struggling? Exhausted? Working 2 jobs? That kind of responsible?" And his expression warped into something ugly, defensive, and he barked, "Life is supposed to be hard. You needed to earn your place in the world, not be handed everything on a silver platter." And hearing that made my stomach twist because every word he threw at me sounded like something he said to himself to sleep at night, a justification he had rehearsed so many times it became truth in his mind, and I snapped back, "Then why didn't you practice what you preach? Why didn't you struggle? Why didn't you earn? Why did you steal my money to make your life easier?" And my mom finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We didn't steal it, we used it for the family." And something inside me detonated at the word family because apparently family meant them, only them, never me, and I turned to her and said, "I'm part of this family too." Or did that stop being true when the money hit your account? She flinched like the words physically hurt her, but she still didn't admit anything, didn't take responsibility, just looked at my father with desperate eyes, silently begging him to fix this, and he stepped forward like a man preparing for war. "Listen," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand how finances work. Your grandfather dumped a massive responsibility on me without explanation. I had to make decisions. Hard decisions. Decisions for all of us." My anger sharpened to a knife's edge as I said, "Decisions like buying a new SUV? Taking luxury vacations? Renovating the house? Paying for my sister's tuition while telling me you couldn't spare a dime?" And Mom tried to jump in, saying, "Your sister needed to go to a good school." But I cut her off, so did I. And she fell silent like someone had pressed mute on her soul. Dad's face reddened, but not from shame, from indignation, entitlement, the same poison that had fueled every lie, every theft, every selfish choice he made, and he hissed, "You're ungrateful. After everything we've done for you. Ungrateful." That word slammed into my chest so hard it stole my breath, because if there was any word I hated more than betrayal, it was ungrateful, and I stepped closer, close enough to see the tightness in his eyes, close enough to see the panic he was hiding under all that arrogance, and I said, "Ungrateful? For what? For being lied to for 8 years? For having my future drained to pay for things I never got to enjoy? For being treated like a burden while you lived off money meant for me? If anything, you should be grateful I haven't called the police yet." The room froze. Mom gasped again, louder this time, and Dad's expression snapped into something dark, almost feral, and for the first time that night he actually looked scared, really scared, because he realized his power was slipping away, and I wasn't the confused, obedient kid he thought I'd remain forever. I could see him scrambling internally, searching for a foothold, and he tried one last pathetic maneuver. "We're your parents. You don't turn your back on family." But I stared him down with a calm that didn't feel human and said, "You turned your back on me the second you touched my trust fund." And watching the color drain from his face was like watching a mask melt off, revealing the truth beneath. He wasn't sorry, he wasn't ashamed. He was terrified of losing control, terrified of consequences, terrified that the life he built on my money was about to crumble. And as that realization settled over the room like a storm cloud thick enough to choke on, I understood something chilling. This wasn't the end of the confrontation. Oh no, this was only the spark. The explosion was still coming. The moment the last word left my mouth, the room turned into a pressure cooker, the kind where heat builds so fast it feels like the walls themselves might buckle, and Dad stepped back like he needed distance to think, running a hand through his hair while Mom hovered behind him, wringing her hands like she wasn't sure whether to defend him or collapse, and I could feel years of resentment gathering inside me like thunderheads, all the times I'd apologize for things that weren't my fault, all the times I blamed myself for opportunities one never had, all the times I believed their narrative that I just needed to work harder. And suddenly I couldn't contain it anymore. Couldn't keep the words trapped behind my teeth, and everything I'd held inside for 8 years came boiling out as I said, "Do you have any idea what my life has been like? I wasn't just struggling, I was drowning. I slept in my car twice when I couldn't make rent. I skipped meals so I could afford gas. I nearly dropped out of school because I didn't have enough money for textbooks, and you were sitting here with a trust fund meant for me, acting like you were doing me a favor by keeping me in the dark." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but not the guilty, aching kind. These were the terrified, frantic tears of someone watching the life she built slip through her fingers, and she whispered, "We didn't know it was that bad." And hearing that made something inside me curdle because she did know they both did. I told them every time I was struggling, every time I needed help, every time I felt like I was falling apart, and they always gave the same rehearsed responses. "Be responsible. We can't bail you out. Life is hard." And now it was clear why. They weren't teaching me anything. They were hiding what they had done, burying the truth under moral lectures while spending money that wasn't theirs, and Dad snapped, "Don't talk to your mother like that." As if I wasn't the one who'd been wronged, and the hypocrisy ignited something volatile in me as I shouted back, "Then tell me the truth. Tell me exactly how much you stole. Tell me what's left. Tell me what you've been hiding. Tell me why you thought you could take everything from me, and still lecture me about earning my place." For a moment I thought he would finally break, finally admit what he'd done. But instead he looked at me with a coldness that sent a chill down my spine and said, "You have no right to accuse us like this. We did what we had to do. We kept this family afloat." Family. That cursed word again, used like a shield, like a license to do whatever he wanted without consequence. And I stepped forward, lowering my voice to something razor sharp. A family protects each other. A family doesn't strip someone's future to make their own lives easier. A family doesn't lie for 8 years. Dad's jaw twitched and he said, "I worked hard for everything we have." And I actually laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound, because the irony of him saying that while standing on the ashes of my future was almost too much to handle, and I said, "No, you worked hard spending someone else's money." And that's when he finally snapped, slamming his glass down on the counter so hard it cracked, and he shouted, "Enough! I did what I had to do. I deserved that money after everything I sacrificed." The room froze. Mom stared at him with wide eyes. I felt my pulse thud in my ears. That word, deserved, hung in the air like a curse, and I took a slow, trembling breath and said, "Not your money. Not your sacrifice. Not your future. Mine." He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off with something darker, something steadier. "And I'm not done." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded document, because on the way here after leaving Grandpa's, I stopped at his attorney's office, where he gave me a copy of the original trust agreement, spelled out in crystal clear legal language the conditions, the dates, the terms, the signatures, including my father's, acknowledging that the funds were to be transferred to me at 18, and used only with mutual approval for my benefit. And when I unfolded it on the counter, the color drained from both their faces like I'd opened a coffin and shown them their own crimes, and I said, "This document proves you weren't allowed to touch the trust without telling me. You violated every condition. You committed fraud, embezzlement, theft, and you lied about it for almost a decade." Mom stumbled back into the counter as if her knees gave out, whispering, "No, no, no, we didn't." "Your father," he said. And Dad cut her off sharply, "Stop talking," which was all I needed to know. He had never told her the full scope either. She'd been complicit, yes, but he had orchestrated everything, controlling her with half-truths the same way he tried to control me, and for the first time I saw her not as the polished, curated mother she pretended to be, but as someone afraid of the man she married, afraid of the truth he'd been hiding, afraid of the consequences. Dad pointed at the document and said, "Where did you get that?" His voice cracking in a way that let me know he already knew the answer, and I said, "Grandpa's attorney. The same one who's helping me file charges." Mom gasped, grabbing my arm with trembling hands, begging, "Please don't do this. We can fix it. We can figure something out." But I pulled my arm away because her panic wasn't for me. It was for the life they built with stolen money, and I said, "You had 8 years to fix it. 8 years to tell me. 8 years to choose honesty. You chose yourselves every single time." Dad shook his head, trying to regain control, but his voice lost its authority as he said, "You don't want to drag this family through the mud. Think about your sister. Think about what this will do to her. And that was the last straw, the final nail in the coffin, because dragging my sister into this was classic manipulation, the same tactic they'd used for years to shut me down, to twist guilt into obedience. And I stared at him with a coldness that made even him flinch as I said, "You should have thought about her before you stole your son's future." And for the first time that night, my father, the man who believed he was untouchable, the man who built his identity on control, looked small, cornered, and terrified. Mom was crying openly now, not because she regretted what they did, but because she finally understood something neither of them wanted to face. This was no longer a conversation. This was the beginning of consequences. Real ones. And as the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, I said the words that shattered whatever illusion of power they still believed they had. "The next time we talk, it will be in front of lawyers." Then I turned and walked toward the door as Mom sobbed behind me and my father whispered something under his breath that sounded less like anger and more like fear, because he finally realized the truth. The life he stole from me was about to come crashing down on him, and there was no version of the future where he walked away unscathed. When I stepped outside and the front door shut behind me with a final echoing click, it didn't feel like leaving my childhood home. It felt like sealing a vault full of ghosts, lies, and rot. And for a moment I stood on the porch with my hands trembling, staring at the streetlights flickering across the quiet neighborhood where everyone believed my parents were the picture-perfect American family, the couple who hosted block parties and donated to school fundraisers, the parents who posted inspirational Facebook quotes about hard work and raising strong kids. And the irony of it hit me so hard I almost laughed, because while they were preaching about responsibility and sacrifice, they were draining a fortune in secret and letting me live like a stray dog picking his way through scraps. And as I walked to my car I felt this eerie hollow calm settling beneath my rage, the kind of stillness that happens right before a storm tears a roof off. And I knew the next moves had to be precise, controlled, strategic, because the truth wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about what kind of people they really were, and what kind of son I refused to be. When I got back to Grandpa's house, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, his posture tense like he'd been frozen there waiting, and the moment he saw my face he didn't ask a single question, just nodded once solemnly, like he already knew how bad the confrontation had gone, and I sat across from him and said, "They didn't deny it." "Not really. They think they were entitled to it." And Grandpa's jaw tightened in a way that made the vein at his temple pulse, but his voice remained calm when he said, "People who lie for that long don't confess, they double down. They justify. They twist it until the truth becomes unrecognizable." I ran both hands through my hair, leaning forward, elbows on my knees, the adrenaline still buzzing through me like electricity, and whispered, "I need to do something. Something real. Something that makes this stop." And Grandpa looked at me with a mix of sorrow and pride, the kind of expression only a man who has watched generations repeat the same mistakes can have, and he said, "I already started the paperwork with the attorney." "But..." He hesitated, my grandfather, a man I had never seen hesitate about anything, and that hesitation made my stomach drop. "But what?" I asked, and he took a slow breath before saying, "Your parents, they've been hiding more than the money." For a second everything inside me went still like the world froze in place and I asked, "More? What more could there possibly be?" And he slid a thin folder across the table toward me with a grimness that made my skin crawl. And when I opened it my breath caught in my throat because the documents inside weren't bank statements or trust papers. They were loan agreements, liens, debt notices, and worst of all, 3 separate applications where my father had used my social security number to open lines of credit. My vision blurred as I whispered, "He used my identity?" And Grandpa nodded, fury simmering just beneath the surface, and said, "He didn't just steal your trust fund, son, he stole your name, your credit, your future in more ways than one." I gripped the sides of the folder so hard the edges dug into my palms, and I felt this rising heat inside my chest, hotter than anything I'd felt in their house, a deep, violent burn that came from a place beyond anger. This was violation, betrayal on a level I didn't have language for, and I muttered, "He didn't just take from me. He built entire lies on top of me." And Grandpa put a trembling hand, yes, trembling, on my shoulder and said, "I'm sorry. I should have checked sooner. I should have been there." I shook my head because none of this was his fault. He had tried to do right by me, but the people who should have protected me had exploited every inch of trust, and I asked, "How much damage?" And Grandpa sighed, pulling out a summary page the attorney had written, and when I read the words delinquent accounts and collections pending, I felt like I was falling through the floor, because I remembered being denied an apartment 3 years ago, and my dad telling me landlords were picky. I remembered being told I didn't qualify for a small car loan and him saying, "Don't worry, son, just keep saving." I remembered feeling like a failure because even when I worked hard, nothing in my financial life ever moved forward. And all this time it wasn't me failing. It was my father actively sabotaging me behind the scenes. "I didn't know," I whispered, my voice shaking, and Grandpa's eyes glistened as he said, "They made sure you couldn't know." I put my head in my hands, trying to breathe, but the rage kept rising like a tide, unstoppable and choking, and when I finally lifted my head I said, "They don't get to walk away from this." "Not this time." Grandpa nodded and said, "The attorney is ready to file. But you need to understand something. Once this starts, there's no going back. This will blow up their lives." I let out a bitter laugh because the idea of protecting them now was almost comedic, and I said, "They blew up my life first." And Grandpa leaned back, studying me for a long time with an expression that looked almost relieved, like he'd been waiting for me to find my own strength, and he said, "Good. Because you'll need that fire." We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every timeline, every signature, building a case so airtight it could suffocate someone, and each page made the truth bite deeper. My father wasn't just greedy, he was cunning, calculated, and reckless, and my mother wasn't just complicit. She was willing to benefit from any lie as long as she could pretend she had nothing to do with it. When we finally finished, Grandpa closed the folder and said, "Tomorrow morning we go to the courthouse." I nodded, exhausted but wired, grieving but fueled, afraid but determined. I went to bed that night in the guest room, but sleep never came. Instead, I lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling as memory after memory replayed. Dad telling me I wasn't ready for financial responsibility, Mom saying things will get better eventually, the way they'd smile when they came home from vacations while I was counting coins in my glove compartment, all the moments that seemed innocent at the time but now felt sinister in hindsight. And by the time the sun crept through the blinds, I didn't feel tired. I felt sharpened, focused, like something inside me had crystallized into purpose. And as I got dressed the next morning, buttoning my shirt with steady hands, one thought kept pulsing through my mind like a heartbeat. They wanted to rewrite my future. Now I'm going to rewrite theirs. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling in my chest when Grandpa's attorney leaned forward, folding his hands like he was about to deliver a eulogy instead of a legal revelation, his voice steady but razor-edged as he said, "Evan, there's something you need to see before we proceed." And he slid a thick envelope across the table toward me, the paper heavy like it was soaked with the weight of every lie my parents had ever told, and as my fingers touched it, I swear my whole body went cold. Because even before I opened it, even before I saw what was inside, some part of me recognized the truth, that nothing about my life, my family, or even my own memories was what I thought. And as I pulled out the stack of documents, a timeline unfolded that made my stomach twist, showing that the trust fund wasn't the only thing kept from me. Apparently, my name had been quietly attached to accounts, properties, and investments I'd never heard of. But the thing that punched the air out of me was the series of letters Grandpa had written to me every birthday from age 5 onward, every single year, letters that were never given to me, letters meant to guide me, encourage me, warn me. And as my hands trembled reading the first one, dated from a time when I was too young to even read, I saw his handwriting telling me that he loved me, that he was proud of me, that he hoped the people raising me would nurture me with honesty, and that if they didn't, I should know someday that he always tried to reach me. And it was like the floor of my entire life collapsed under me because I suddenly remembered all the times mail came for the house and my mom quickly filtered through it claiming it was all bills. The way any package addressed to me magically disappeared before I ever saw it. The way I always assumed my family was just distant with Grandpa and never questioned why I never heard from him except during rare holidays. My throat tightened as I flipped to the next letter. Then the next, watching my entire childhood rewrite itself in real time. Each envelope a piece of proof that my parents and sister had actively built a wall between me and the one man who actually gave a damn about me. And when I reached the letter from when I turned 18, a letter Grandpa wrote knowing it was the year the trust legally transferred to my name, my heart cracked open reading his warning. If you are reading this and the trust was never discussed with you, someone is betraying you. Do not let family manipulation rob you of your future, son. Question everything. I swear I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. All I felt was fire rising in my ribs because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about identity, belonging, betrayal on a level that fundamentally rewires a person. I looked up at Grandpa, whose expression was raw with regret, like he was carrying decades of guilt for things he didn't even know were happening, and he whispered, "I tried, Evan. I really tried. But they kept you from me. And the worst part? I believed him. For the first time in my life, I believed someone else over my own family, because suddenly every dismissive comment, every strange moment, every cold birthday interaction made sense, and I felt this tornado building inside me. Rage mixed with grief mixed with humiliation, because it wasn't just that they had stolen $3.4 million from me, they had stolen my relationship with the only person who ever saw me as more than a resource to control. I asked the attorney a question I already knew the answer to. Is there proof of who accessed the accounts? And he nodded slowly, pulling another set of papers from his briefcase, his voice low as he said, "Every withdrawal, every transfer, every forged authorization was made from devices registered to your parents' home, and your sister's name appears on 2 of the transactions." It felt like the air in the room turned thick enough to choke me. My own sister. The girl who used to steal my Halloween candy and my hoodies and who I thought was just annoying, not malicious, had been knowingly participating in draining my future dry. My hands curled into fists, but Grandpa gently placed his palm on my wrist, grounding me before I could spiral, his voice steady as he said, "They are expecting you to fold. They believe you're fragile. They believe you're still the boy they manipulated. But you're not." And he was right. Something in me hardened that moment, something sharp and unyielding, because I realized that confronting them wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming the part of myself they tried to smother for years. The attorney then revealed the next blow. They also attempted to file for early liquidation under your name 5 years ago, but your grandfather refused consent at the last moment when certain signatures didn't look right. And when I heard that, I felt the blood drain from my face because 5 years ago I was drowning working 2 minimum wage jobs while Mom and Dad told me, "Life is hard for everyone, stop complaining." And meanwhile they were literally trying to cash out my future behind my back. Suddenly every struggle, every late night shift, every moment I felt like a disappointment or a burden wasn't an accident. It was a design. They wanted me desperate. They wanted me controllable. They wanted me dependent on them so I would never question why I had nothing. My voice cracked as I whispered, "They hated me." And Grandpa shook his head instantly, fiercely, the way a real parent is supposed to, saying, "They feared you. That's different. They feared what you'd become if you ever knew the truth." And that landed like a spark hitting gasoline in my chest, because for the first time, I saw myself not as the overlooked kid in the corner of the family photo, but as the threat they had been trying to contain, the heir they wanted to erase, the pawn they tried to reshape into obedience. I sat back, staring at the pile of letters, bank statements, legal records, the blueprint of a decade-long conspiracy built by people who shared my last name. And in that moment, something irreversible clicked inside me. I wasn't going to confront them as the son they manipulated. I was going to confront them as the man they underestimated. My revenge wouldn't be loud, it would be seismic. And as the room fell into a heavy, simmering silence, Grandpa leaned forward, eyes burning with the same fire I felt in my chest, and he asked the question that sealed everything. "Evan, are you ready to take it all back?" And I answered without hesitation, "Yes." But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the real twist was still waiting, and the truth that would crack my entire world open hadn't even been revealed yet.
I thought the worst was over when I served them the legal notice, thought the confrontation, the screaming, the unraveling of every lie was the breaking point, but the real twist came from someone who had been silent the entire evening. My grandmother, who had sat in the far corner of the room like a faded portrait, eyes downcast, hands folded neatly. A woman who barely spoke during any family gathering and whom I had always assumed simply lacked the energy for conflict, but when she finally stood, her voice steady and eerily calm as she said, "Enough," the entire room froze, including Grandpa, who turned toward her with a confusion I had never seen in him, and for one long moment, the air felt electrically charged as she stepped forward and said, "There's something you all need to know before this goes any further." And the way she looked at my parents made the hairs on my arms rise because it wasn't anger. No, it was something far colder, like she had been holding a truth inside her for decades and finally decided to let it spill. She walked over to me, placed a small, trembling hand on my shoulder, and said, You deserve the real story, son, and the room seemed to tilt as she turned toward Grandpa, whose face had gone pale, as though he already sensed what she was about to reveal. She took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater, and said, "Your grandfather didn't set up your trust fund because of guilt or generosity, Evan. He set it up because you were never supposed to be raised by them in the first place," and instantly my stomach dropped, Dad stiffened, Mom gasped, and Grandpa whispered a low, warning Marjorie. But she ignored him, her eyes blazing with a courage I didn't know she had as she continued. "Your mother and father weren't struggling financially when you were born. They were unfit," and the word sliced through the room like a blade, my pulse pounding as she added, "legally unfit," and suddenly Mom was on her feet, shouting, "Don't you dare." But Grandma silenced her with a single glare so sharp it felt like a lifetime of silence cracking open. She turned back to me with tears forming and said, "Your parents had a long history of gambling debt, fraud, and putting themselves ahead of every responsibility they had. When you were born, social services were notified. Your grandfather fought tooth and nail to take custody of you so you wouldn't end up in the system, but your parents disappeared with you before the paperwork was finalized, and my entire world spun because I had lived my entire life believing I came from a stable, if cold, household, never imagining I had been essentially taken, hidden from the one person who tried to protect me." Grandpa's voice trembled as he stepped forward and said, "Marjorie, please." But she pressed on, shaking now, saying, "He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to feel like you were stolen, even though that's exactly what happened. They ran with you and refused to give you back, threatening to raise you out of spite unless he agreed to fund them for years and stay silent. So he did. He set aside money for you, fought legally for you behind the scenes, and allowed your parents to walk away without punishment because he didn't want you growing up watching them go to prison. And suddenly everything, every missing piece of my life, every inconsistency, every strange hostility my parents had toward Grandpa made excruciating sense. This wasn't simple greed. This was the aftermath of a crime committed by the very people who raised me." Mom screamed, "That's not true. We were struggling, not unfit." But Grandma shot back, "You forged documents, skipped mandated parenting evaluations, and took Evan without authorization. You weren't protecting him, you were using him," and Dad erupted, shouting, "We deserved compensation for raising him. We did the work." And that was the moment Grandpa finally exploded, his voice thunderous as he roared, "You didn't raise him, you held him hostage. And you kept him from me." And the amount of grief in his voice gutted me. I felt my chest constrict as the truth sank in. I wasn't just manipulated, I wasn't just stolen from financially, I had been stolen as a person, ripped from the life that should have been mine, and raised by people who viewed me not as a son but as leverage. I looked at my parents, really looked, and saw not protectors but parasites who fed off me for years and panicked the second their meal ticket found out. Mom broke down. Sobbing into her hands, Dad paced like a trapped animal. Alicia stared in horror because it was the first time in her life realizing that she wasn't the victim. It was me. Grandpa approached me, his voice shaking as he said, "I'm sorry, Evan. I tried. I really tried." And for the first time, I saw him not as a wealthy, distant patriarch but as a father who had spent years grieving a child he couldn't save. I turned to my parents and said the final words I would ever speak to them, "You didn't just steal money. You stole me. And I'm done." They begged, Mom on her knees, Dad trying to twist the story one last time, Alicia reaching for my arm, but it was too late. I walked out with Grandpa and Grandma, leaving the three of them in the ruins of their own making, three people who had built their lives on theft and manipulation and were finally facing the consequences. The following weeks were a whirlwind: legal proceedings, restraining orders, recovery of stolen funds, psychological evaluations, things no son should have to navigate. Because of the people who raised him. But through every step, Grandpa never left my side, Grandma attended every meeting, and for the first time in my life, I felt what real family support looked like. By the time the courts ruled in my favor, granting me full restitution, barring my parents and sister from any access to my inheritance or my life, I didn't feel victorious, I felt free. As we walked out of the courthouse, Grandpa placed his arm around my shoulder and said, "Now you get to build the life they tried to take," and for once, I believed him. We drove to his estate, where he handed me a small key, not to a vault or a safe, but to a room filled with every letter he ever wrote, every memory he saved, every piece of the life I was meant to have, and as I stood there reading the words he wrote for me at age 5, 10, 18, I realized something. Revenge wasn't the victory, reclaiming myself was, and for the first time in years, I breathed without weight in my lungs, knowing. The cycle of lies, manipulation, and generational damage ended with me. I wasn't the stolen child anymore. I wasn't the forgotten heir. I was finally the man my grandfather always hoped I'd become. And the best part? They couldn't steal me back. And if you love intense family drama stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more.